The paving crew showed up at 7 in the morning with no notice, and by the time I got outside in my work boots, half a bucket of coffee still in my hand, they'd already laid 40 feet of fresh asphalt straight across my private rail spur. "You can't do that," I said. "That's my property line. That spur's been there since before this subdivision existed." The foreman, a heavy-set guy named Doug, barely looked up from his clipboard. "HOA cleared this. Ridgeline Estates owns the easement for the new entrance. Take it up with the board." My son Caleb, 10 years old, was standing on the porch behind me in his socks, backpack already on for school, staring at the machinery tearing through the gravel bed his grandfather had laid decades ago. "Dad, is that the train track? The one you said used to bring the lumber in?" I didn't have an answer for him yet, because I was still trying to process what I was looking at. The spur wasn't decorative. It wasn't some quaint relic I kept around for nostalgia. It was a recorded rail easement, deeded to my property specifically, going back to 1961, when this land was still my grandfather's lumberyard before the HOA ever existed, before Ridgeline Estates was anything but empty acreage. I'm Grant Pruitt, 39, from just outside Chattanooga, Tennessee. I've been raising Caleb alone for the better part of 3 years, since his mother and I split after she decided small-town life and a modest income from my machine shop weren't the future she wanted. I don't run a huge operation, precision metal fabrication, mostly contract work for local manufacturers, but it's steady, and it's mine, and it sits on land that's been in my family for 3 generations. The HOA, Ridgeline Estates, built up around my property about 6 years ago, developed by a company that carved luxury lots out of the old timberland surrounding my grandfather's original parcel. I'd been a reluctant neighbor to that development from the start, mostly ignoring their newsletters and their fines for things like an unmowed strip of grass that technically fell on my side of a shared boundary. I paid what I had to pay, kept to myself, and let them build their gated entrance and their clubhouse without much complaint. What I hadn't expected was for them to pave straight through a recorded, still active rail easement on my deed, apparently believing nobody would check the paperwork closely enough to notice, or that a single dad running a small machine shop wouldn't have the time, money, or will to fight a homeowners association with a multi-million-dollar entrance project already under construction. They were wrong about that, and they had no idea yet just how expensive that mistake was about to become. Caleb's mother, Renee, and I met in community college, back before I took over my grandfather's machine shop from my dad, who'd taken it over from his. We got married young, had Caleb at 26, and for a while things were good. Not easy, but good. The kind of steady life built on early mornings at the shop and evenings at the kitchen table doing homework together as a family. The cracks started showing about 4 years in. Renee had gone to college for graphic design, and the shop life, the grease under my nails, the modest but reliable income, the fact that I'd never wanted anything bigger than what my grandfather built, started feeling like a cage to her instead of a foundation. She took a remote design job for an agency out of Atlanta, and within a year she was talking more about client dinners and networking events than anything happening in Chattanooga. The divorce wasn't dramatic. Renee didn't cheat, didn't disappear overnight. She just decided, calmly and clearly, that she wanted a different life than the one we built, and she wanted it without a 10-year-old attached to a machine shop in a small Tennessee town. She signed over primary custody without much of a fight, which I've never fully understood, but I didn't question it too hard either. I just focused on Caleb. She sends birthday cards. She calls sometimes, inconsistently. Caleb doesn't ask about her much anymore, though I know he thinks about it more than he says. I tolerated a lot from Ridgeline Estates in those early years for one simple reason. I didn't have the bandwidth to fight a legal battle while raising a kid alone and running a business. 2 years ago, they fined me $400 for a work trailer parked in my own driveway, similar to complaints I'd later hear other small property owners around here had also faced. I paid it. Fighting felt like a luxury I couldn't afford, not with school pickups and shop deadlines eating every hour of my day. Last year, they sent a notice claiming a section of my fence line encroached on shared green space, even though my property survey clearly showed otherwise. I spent a weekend I didn't have resurveying the boundary myself just to avoid a formal dispute, and once I proved my case informally to a sympathetic board member, they dropped it without apology. Both times, I told myself the same thing. Pick your battles, don't let this consume time you need for Caleb. That mindset had served me fine for years. Standing in my driveway watching asphalt cure over a piece of family history that predated the entire subdivision, I finally understood that Ridgeline Estates hadn't learned patience or restraint from my willingness to let things go. They'd learned that I probably wouldn't fight back at all. I called the county recorder's office that same afternoon and paid for a certified copy of the original 1961 easement grant. It was exactly as I remembered from the file my grandfather kept, a recorded rail spur easement, deeded specifically to the Pruitt property, predating any zoning or development agreement Ridgeline Estates could have filed decades later. Then I called the HOA's management office. A woman named Sheila Vantage answered, polite but immovable. Mr. Pruitt, the board's position is that the spur was abandoned rail infrastructure, and the paving falls under the community's improvement easement for the new entrance. If you have a dispute, you're welcome to bring it to the next board meeting. It's not abandoned. It's on my deed. I have the recorded easement in my hand right now. I'll pass that along to the board. I went to that meeting a week later, copy of the easement in a folder, expecting a conversation. Instead, I found the same energy I'd encountered with the fence line dispute the year before, the board treating my documentation as an inconvenience rather than a legitimate legal claim. The HOA president, a man named Roy Callahan, ran the meeting with the confidence of someone who'd never had a homeowner actually push back on anything. Mr. Pruitt, the entrance project is already 60% complete. Ridgeline invested significant capital based on engineering plans that included this route. We're not going to halt construction over a spur nobody's used in 50 years. Nobody using it doesn't erase the easement, Roy. It's still legally mine. He waved that off, the way you'd wave off a fly. We'll have our attorney review your documentation. In the meantime, construction continues. That night, I sat at the kitchen table going through my grandfather's old file box, the one with decades of paperwork on the lumberyard and the property. Buried in it, I found something I hadn't thought about in years. A 1987 letter from the county acknowledging the easement's continued validity after a previous rezoning attempt, explicitly noting that the rail spur access could not be altered without the property owner's written consent. Caleb wandered in while I was reading it, still in his school clothes, backpack forgotten on the couch. Dad, are they gonna get in trouble for the tracks? I think they might, buddy. Good. Grandpa's tracks aren't supposed to just disappear. He said it simply, the way kids state things that feel obviously true to them, and it landed harder than I expected. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was the last physical piece of my grandfather's life sitting on this land, paved over by people who'd assumed a single dad running a small shop wouldn't have the resources or resolve to make them answer for it. I called an attorney the next morning. The attorney's name was Marisol Guerrero, a property and easement law specialist out of Chattanooga who'd handled two similar HOA disputes in the past 5 years. She reviewed the 1961 grant, the 1987 letter, and my current property survey within a week. This is about as clean a case as I've seen, she told me. The easement is valid, recorded, and specifically protected against alteration without your written consent. What they did isn't a gray area. It's a straightforward violation, and depending on how they proceed from here, it could get expensive for them fast. I sent Ridgeline Estates a formal cease and desist through Marisol, demanding they halt further construction on the disputed section and begin remediation. Instead of responding through their attorney, Roy Callahan showed up at my shop unannounced, 3 days later, while Caleb was there doing homework at the desk in my office after school. Grant, let's be reasonable here, Roy said, glancing at Caleb before lowering his voice like that made the conversation more private. The board's willing to offer you a $5,000 settlement and a formal easement release. That's real money for a man running a shop like this. Save yourself the legal fees, save your kid the stress of watching his dad fight a battle he can't win. Caleb's not stressed, Roy. He's doing his math homework. And $5,000 doesn't come close to covering what a court might award for a knowing easement violation on an active construction project. Roy's expression shifted, the polite mask slipping just slightly. You really want to be the guy who held up a $2.4 million entrance project over a rusted piece of track nobody's used since Reagan was president? That number stuck with me. 2.4 million, said so casually, like it was supposed to intimidate me into folding. It told me something important. Ridgeline Estates had sunk real capital into this entrance already, capital that made the easement violation a genuine liability instead of a minor inconvenience they could shrug off. I declined the settlement. 2 weeks later, the HOA sent formal notice that they were pursuing an emergency injunction to continue construction, arguing public safety and community access required finishing the entrance regardless of the easement dispute. Marisol wasn't worried. They're trying to build momentum before a judge actually reviews the underlying property rights. Standard pressure tactic. We'll respond and request the court examine the 1961 grant and the 1987 letter directly. What worried me more than the legal maneuvering was finding out, through a neighbor 2 lots down, that Ridgeline Estates had approached at least one other property owner with a similar abandoned infrastructure argument the year before, a drainage culvert dispute that homeowner had simply let go rather than fight. Roy Callahan wasn't guessing that homeowners wouldn't push back. He'd learned it worked before. The court hearing took nearly 4 months to get scheduled, and in that time Ridgeline Estates kept building, betting that momentum and legal fees would eventually wear me down. Marisol filed for a formal injunction of our own, backed by the 1961 grant and the 1987 letter, and a judge granted a temporary halt on further construction across the disputed section while the underlying property rights got sorted out properly. During discovery, Marisol's team requested Ridgeline Estates engineering and planning records for the entrance project. What came back confirmed something Roy Callahan had never admitted outright. The development's own surveyors had flagged the rail easement during initial planning, 2 years before construction began, and recommended rerouting the entrance to avoid it. The board overruled that recommendation, choosing the cheaper, more direct route anyway, believing the easement was old enough that nobody would enforce it. That single planning document changed everything about the case. This wasn't a misunderstanding about abandoned infrastructure. It was a documented, informed decision to build across a legally protected easement, made by people who assumed a small shop owner and single dad wouldn't have the resources to hold them accountable. The judge ruled in my favor on the easement violation. Ridgeline Estates was ordered to either formally negotiate a purchase of the easement rights for me at fair market value, or reroute the entrance entirely at their own cost. Given that construction was already 60% complete along the disputed path, rerouting meant demolishing and rebuilding a significant portion of the entrance, an expense their own internal estimates, entered into evidence, put it just over $2 million on top of what they'd already spent. Combined with legal fees, court costs, and the delay penalties written into their contractor agreement, the total impact landed close to the $2.4 million mark Roy had once thrown at me like a threat. The HOA board didn't survive the fallout quietly. Homeowners who'd been paying steep dues for years, expecting competent management, started asking pointed questions once the court records became public. 2 board members resigned within a month, including the treasurer who'd approved the original budget overrun without flagging the surveyor's warning to the rest of the board. Roy Callahan didn't resign voluntarily. He lost his seat in the next election by a wide margin, the community finally aware of just how much his reasonable $5,000 settlement offer had actually been trying to avoid. I didn't take the buyout for the easement rights. Marisol negotiated instead for Ridgeline Estates to fund a proper rerouting of their entrance, leaving the rail spur intact, restored to its original gravel bed at their expense. It took another 8 months to finish, but by the following spring, the track sat exactly where my grandfather had laid it, undisturbed, with a small brass marker. Marisol suggested we add noting the easement's protected status, so no future board could claim ignorance again. Caleb helped me place that marker himself, an 11-year-old with a shovel half his height, packing gravel around the base while I held it steady. "Grandpa would have liked this," he said, brushing dirt off his hands. "Yeah, buddy. I think he would. It's been almost a year since that court decision. My shop's still running the same as always, steady work, nothing flashy, exactly the kind of life I built after Renee left. She still sends birthday cards, still calls occasionally, and Caleb and I have settled into a rhythm that doesn't need her involvement to feel complete. I don't know if that will ever change, and I've stopped needing it to. Ridgeline Estates has a new board now, more cautious, more willing to actually read the paperwork before making expensive decisions. I still get the occasional HOA newsletter, though I notice they've stopped sending fine notices for things that don't hold up under a second look. Roy Callahan moved out of the subdivision entirely about 6 months after losing his board seat. I don't know where he ended up, and I've made my peace with not knowing. What I keep coming back to isn't the $2.4 million, or the courtroom, or even Roy's face when the ruling came down. It's Caleb, standing over that brass marker in our backyard, understanding without me having to explain it that some things aren't supposed to just disappear because someone decided they were inconvenient. Tell me what you would have done in my position. This fictional story was created for entertainment, education, and dramatic reflection.